It was actually like the worst reading month I've ever read. She was a bit boring. A hefty woman who will fight and like throw an axe. Love her. Hello. Welcome to today's video. Apologies for that bit of delay in my publishing schedule. I set a goal to publish once a week this year, and I've already missed it. I had quite a bit of work travel over the past month, and I did not properly plan ahead. But I'm excited to share with you a wrap-up of everything I read in January, because while it was difficult to find time to film, I was able to get some good reading in there. And actually, maybe not good reading, because it was actually like the worst reading month I've ever read in terms of my enjoyment of the books, but I want to share my thoughts with you anyway. At the beginning of January, I posted a TBR video where I sort of mapped out some of the books I wanted to read this month. So I'll be giving you an update on what I thought of those books, as well as some of the additional ones that I hadn't planned to read but managed to check out. This will be maybe a little bit more chatty, but I will say, originally I was recording this video and I have some other clips that I recorded as I read them. So, you know, I would get a portion through a book, I would record my thoughts, and then when I was done, I shared an update of my overall opinion. But honestly, just 2 books that I read, or no, 3, was already like 45 minutes of footage. So I was like, okay, I know I wanted this to be a chatty video, but like that's a bit too much. I have to draw the line. So instead, I'm sitting down with you and I'm gonna do my best to give succinct summaries of all these books and my thoughts on them. I do want to keep it generally non-spoiler, but I will share my thoughts for those of you who have read them and want to know, you know, someone else's opinion on them. Starting off with the first one, Girls of Paper and Fire. This book follows either Lee or Lay. I'm not totally sure the pronunciation. I think in my TBR I went with Lay, so let's go with Lay. It's fantasy. Most of these books are fantasy. And she's in this world where there's different castes, with Paper being the lowest caste, and those are people who are fully human. There's like Steel and something else caste, and those people have like demon blood mixed into them, with the highest caste being fully demons because they're more powerful than humans. So she has golden eyes, and she gets taken by the Demon King's men to join this year's group of paper girls, which are essentially like his live-in courtesans, I think would be the right terminology. But, you know, they're living there to fulfill his sexual needs, living in the castle, that is. And so every year there's a certain number chosen, I think it's like 8, but one of his generals sort of got in trouble. So he is like, oh, I've heard a rumor of this girl with golden eyes, I'm gonna go get her and then I'll get in the Demon King's good graces. So the general comes, snatches her, takes her to the castle. So the book goes from there, where she is now the 9th paper girl, which is, you know, scandalous because there's only supposed to be a certain number. There are mistresses that oversee the paper girls. They're training them in classes how to conduct themselves, how to channel their inner chi. It's more Asian inspired with the fantasy and magical components. Every so often, the Demon King will summon one of the paper girls to his room, and so they'll fulfill their duties, you know, to him for the night. And so Lay is dreading this before she's ultimately chosen last for, you know, his first round of selecting the girls. There's romance involved, which may not be what you think. There also is a setup, because it is a series, so there's a setup for more plot with the people rebelling against the Demon King, and that infiltrates itself into the paper girls, and so Lay finds herself wrapped up in this drama that she didn't necessarily plan to. Ultimately, I gave this book a 1 star. I found it very, like, I really didn't like Lay, the main character. She was very bland to me and had like no personality. There's another girl in the story, one of the paper girls, who becomes, you know, a primary character, and she's like so much more interesting. I think the story would have been better from her perspective. She's more of like a warrior girl, whereas Lei has like no skills and nothing. Um, so she was a bit boring. Also warning, there are graphic, violent scenes in this book, so read the warnings before you read it. There were trigger warnings included within the book. Also, throughout the book, I found that certain plot points weren't revealed, and it seems like it was for suspense purposes, when ultimately it just left the reader like, what? Like, there was a point where we revealed who the group of rebels are that are, you know, fighting against the Demon King's reign. And we learn like, oh, this one character is a part of this group. Posted at like the end of a chapter or something, as if we're supposed to like know who the warrior group is and be like, oh my gosh, they're in this group. But like, we have no idea before that who this group is. Like, it was never mentioned. So then in the chapter following, it then says like, the warrior group was this ancient blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you can't do reveals like that. Like, you have to say what something is before you try to make it like this big drop. I hope I'm explaining that correctly, but I found that at multiple points in the story where it was supposed to be this like, but it was like, but what is that? So yeah, I didn't really enjoy it. So I won't be continuing that series, and it was 1 star for me. I'm already finding myself getting long-winded with these, but on to book 2, which was The Luminaries by Susan Dennard. I had high hopes for this, and this was another 1 star for me. In terms of what it's about, it is about Winnie Wednesday, who is a part of this clan. The families are in clans based off of like the days of the week, which is not explained why they're named after the days of the week in the story, but regardless, Winnie Wednesday and her immediate family have kind of been like shunned from their clan, and they essentially live in a world that's adjacent to the regular human world, but they're like external, and they battle nightmares which try to escape into the world. So they kind of like live in foresty areas, and within these forests live demons, and I think there's like 14 demons in the world, but the number continues to grow. So these clans of warriors live near these demons, where these demons like live, and fight the nightmares that the demons create. Hopefully that makes sense. I really only gathered that until the end of the story, because like I think like 75% of the way through it explains that there are like demon spirits around the world. So you don't really know like what the setting is really up until well into the book, but that's where they live. Winnie's dad betrayed their clan years ago, and so her mom and her brother have like been shunned from the Wednesday clan. They're not allowed to train with them anymore. They can't belong. Oh, and I forgot to mention, in terms of like the nightmares that are created, it's like any mythological creature, like a vampira, a manticore, I don't know, everything you can imagine. Her immediate family has been kind of shunned, so they have like really low jobs. They lost all their friends. They're not able to train with the hunters anymore. But in their society, whenever, ignore my dog. Whenever you're about to turn 16, you can complete the hunter trials and become a luminary, who are the hunters of the nightmares. Winnie's about to turn 16, and so she wants to complete these trials so she can like regain her family's status in the Wednesday clan. So that's the premise of the story. Throughout the book, she's completing the 3 different trials, with the 3rd being towards the very end. There's kind of a love interest in there who is like the most plain of the plain of the plain, like bad boys that you could imagine. Like, oh goodness gracious. I'm surprised he like wasn't wearing a fedora for that matter, because it felt so like 2012. And Yeah, it wasn't a long story at all, but in terms of my overall thoughts, it was another 1 star. So imagine my disappointment at 2 1-star reads right off the bat at the beginning of the year. But it was so not good. But yeah, overall it felt like the book was super surface level. Like it didn't really get deep into anything. And it was very short, which you'll normally find when authors are first starting to publish, because if they haven't like proven themselves as an author, publishers normally don't want, you know, like a 500-page book. But this was extremely short. It was like barely over 300 pages. Maybe it was like 298, but it's from an author who's published. So I don't know why she didn't just make it longer. Like it was so minimal. I felt like I barely knew anyone. I didn't care about anyone, and overall it was kind of boring. So 1 star for me. Next book, I think I'm gonna do a whole video about, but for those of you, if you know, you know. I was so excited to read Gideon the Ninth. I made a whole video about exciting fantasy reads in 2023, and I talked about, I think it was the 3rd book in the series, maybe the 4th book in the series, and how I was excited for that one because I anticipated liking all the rest of the books in the series. That was me being like very like, oh yeah, I'm gonna like this book, so I'm excited for the rest of the series. Much to my dismay, this was my first DNF of the year. I don't even know if I can do a whole video about it because I got to 20% of this book, and that was like, I think it took me like 3 days to get to 20%. And I read relatively quickly, and 20% for this book was about 100 pages, which I could do, you know, 2-3 hours. I'm not like crazy fast, but like I read, you know, relatively quickly. And oh my gosh, I like can't even portray how disappointed I was in DNFing Gideon the Ninth. I was so excited. I had waited 12 weeks on hold for the Kindle version from my library for this book, and it was just not good. So obviously 1 star, I DNF'd it. Oh my goodness, I knew there were lots of reviews of people being like, oh, this is so chaotic, I had no idea what was happening, but I loved every minute of it. So I was like, oh, okay, this is gonna be a fun time. But when they said chaotic, oh my gosh, I have absolutely no idea what was happening, and it was not a fun, confusing. It was like, I don't even know what I'm reading because this is so confusing. Like, it's intentionally annoying. Like, okay, if you've ever watched Riverdale, the TV show with Cole Sprouse, or is it Dylan? I don't remember. If you've ever watched Riverdale, Gideon is like literally Jughead from that one scene where he's like, look at me, I'm weird, I'm a weirdo. Do you ever see me without this hat on? No, it's because I'm weird. And, or like something like that, where it's like the most cringy, like I'm different, I'm not like other girls kind of thing. Oh my gosh, I absolutely hated it. I did not like Gideon. So annoying. I did not understand the world at all. And it honestly made me mad, as you can see, because I was like, I hate when a book like makes me feel stupid. Or I'm like, what am I not getting? And I was getting so mad, so that was very disappointing. The next book was my first good read of the year, yay! And it was also the first book I have ever read by John Gwyn, and it is The Shadow of the Gods, which is the first book in the Bloodsworn saga series. So there's 2 books published so far, and I think it's supposed to be a trilogy overall. So that's exciting, but this book is multi-POV, so it follows 3 characters. It's, what is it, Orca, Elvar, and Varg, I think they are. And so it's Norse mythology inspired, and again, fantasy. So essentially, each character has a unique plot point. For Orca, it's her husband, and her son, and they kind of live in a remote area near this main village, and the village is having some trouble where their Jarl, which I think is like their governor or like the leader of their area of the world, their Jarl is having to like kind of do seedy negotiations with the queen to maintain their land, so they're kind of having to like give up a lot more taxes and things that the people want. So Orca and her husband are navigating that, while also there's like foreshadowing that something is off with them, where they kind of need to like keep their distance from others and like they're kind of dangerous. And Orca often has these like horrific flashbacks where you're like, oh, okay, something is happening with this girl, something's happened in her past where like she is not well, but she's like super like boss queen, like a hefty woman who will fight and like throw an axe. Love her. Elvar, I think, is like a blonde warrior girl, and it gets kind of like the hard thing about this book is it was very confusing because all the names, I'm not as familiar with like Norse mythology names, so it was hard to keep track. And then some of the names are very similar to each other. So there's like the Bloodsworn and another warrior group that starts with a B. So Elvar was in one of them, and they're like a traveling bounty hunters in a way. Like they're traveling in one of those really long boats, and their clan, maybe they're the Bloodsworn, they like travel to kill people for the queen and like earn money for jarls. Like jarls will hire them to do something for them. And so that's Elvar. And she's like really high up within the ranks, even though she's young. Then there's Varg, who was a slave on a farm, but then escaped. And so he went to town to try to find some answers because he wants to find out who killed his sister. So he goes to this town to get access to like these mystic witches who can like see the answers. But the lady who's there is a part of this other group of warriors that also starts with a B. And so they're having these trials. There's like this line, and they're having these trials with this giant elf or troll. And people are like, oh, like if you want to speak to the Cedar Witch, I think is what she's called, you have to join this warrior group. So he waits in line to fight this troll to gain entrance into the warrior group. So it's essentially like if you're still standing after the fight, you'll get in. So that's like each of their stories, but the myth of the world is like so intricate. There are gods that battled hundreds of years ago, and in their war, the world like restarted. So there are some people that are pure human. There are some people who have blood of the gods mixed in them, and so they have certain powers, but they try to keep it hidden because the humans will like kill them because they don't want a repeat of the gods destroying the world. And there's also myth that like one of the gods, this dragon god, is trapped in this kind of like other realm where you could access it from their world, but it's like hidden. So you need like the powers of a cedar witch to access it. So the stories are all intermixing. By the end of the book, you get a hint of like how they're all gonna intermingle. But for this first book, they each have their own plot, and I absolutely loved it. Like, normally, I will admit, I always tend to read like a romance fantasy book, and there was like not really romance in this. But I absolutely loved it. Other than the names, that was confusing. This was like a 4-star for me. I think it would have been 5-star maybe if there was some romance, but it was 4-star. I love it. Another read for me, Gallant by V.E. Schwab. I absolutely loved Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. That was a 5-star read for me. So I was like, ooh, more V.E. Schwab books. This is my second book by her. Gallant follows the main character, Olivia, who grows up in this like school for orphan girls. And she gets a letter one day saying, from like her long lost uncle, saying like, oh, come home, you have a home here in Gallant, which is like the name of this house. So the story is very mystical because Olivia is mute, so she does not speak at all. And her mother is supposedly dead, like she was abandoned, but she has a journal from her mother with stories of Gallant and warning her never to go there. But she has nowhere else to go. She needs to leave the school eventually. So she gets this letter. She's like, okay, I'm going to Gallant. So then she goes to the house and then starts a story where there's like It's more of like a mystical horror thriller, I guess, but it's YA, so it's very minimal. And there are like spirits in the house, and yeah, overall this was not really good for me. I did not enjoy it. It was quite boring and not really interesting at all. Like, there's a mystery where through the gate exterior to Gallant's garden, there is an alternate version of Gallant where it's like broken down and dying, and I guess like death lives there, I think is who he was supposed to be. So he likes to trap the spirits of the Pryor family, Olivia Pryor. And so yeah, he's like trying to trap her, which yeah, whatever. Anyway, so it wasn't really good. It was like, it didn't feel suspenseful. It didn't really feel like a interesting world. I didn't really care about Olivia. It was short, so it was like, I didn't really get the point of this one, but on to the next. The next one, it was okay. I read The Awakening by Kate, is it Chopin? Let's go with Chopin. It's a classic. It's a short book, but it's about a married woman with 2 kids who kind of has like a life crisis where she's like unsatisfied with her life. She doesn't really care about her children. Like, she loves them, but like she doesn't want to be a mom. She doesn't care about her husband. And they're living in somewhere in the South. Maybe it's, I can't remember where, but they're like, it starts off on a beach vacation, and they're, you know, like rich people, and one of the guys there who is like a younger man, but always hangs around with the families who vacation in this rich area, likes her, and so they kind of have this like romance. Ultimately, the story is her like going through a crisis where she doesn't like her life, and her children end up going with their grandma for the summer at the same time that her husband goes on a long trip for work, so she's home alone for like a few months. And over the course of that time, she has like this huge mental crisis and decides to move out at first, and then that love interest that she had comes back, and she's like wanting to be with him. And yeah, ultimately it has a bad ending, but overall it was fine. It was like a 2-star read. It was, classics kind of just are boring to me. The way they're written, it's obviously like older style. I know at the time this was like a scandalous read because it was like, oh my gosh, a woman not wanting to do her like womanly duties of raising her children or not being satisfied, like so scandalous. So it's obviously like less scandalous now, but just in terms of like the story, it just didn't really interest me that much, but it wasn't the worst. After The Awakening, I read a book that I was super excited for. I got an advanced reader copy, or an ARC of it, and it is Gwen and Art Are Not in Love. Now, in my TBR, I misread the premise of this book and I was thinking it was a King Arthur retelling, but it's actually not. So it's within King Arthur's universe, but it's like hundreds of years later. So they have the lore and the, you know, historical knowledge of him and mention him within the book. You know, there's Excalibur references and all that good stuff. But this book takes place, it follows Gwen, or I think her full name's Gwendolyn, her brother Gabriel, who are, I don't even remember like the names of their exact towns. I think they're supposed to be in like England, but her and her brother are the son and daughter of the king and queen of their area, and she is betrothed to be married to Arthur, who does get his namesake from King Arthur. And his dad is I think he's like a king of another kingdom nearby, but they've been betrothed since they were children to be married because they wanted to join forces. I think Arthur's dad is like known as kind of like a rebellious guy, but more known to the regular people. So Gwen's dad wants this marriage to show the people that like they care about the regular folk. The plot is like following Gwen's anxiety over having to marry Arthur, and reveals another love interest who she truly is interested in, and her and Art ultimately like join together to fool everyone into thinking that they're really together when really they have their own love interests. Overall, I think this book probably would have been cuter if it was a retelling of King Arthur, because honestly there wasn't really anything in the book plot-wise that was impacted by it being in King Arthur's world. Like, it could have been any other world. Like, characters spoke very modern. At one point one of the characters uses Excalibur, but they could have used any other sword. Like, it wasn't really significant. It just felt like, why was this even King Arthur? Like, maybe just to make it sell more, because then it fooled people into thinking it was, like it did for me. But overall, like, I didn't like Gwen. She was a very annoying character who felt very like, oh, woe is me, but really she's like a super privileged person. And she didn't actually have that much character growth. I gave this, oh, another 1 star. The next book I was really excited about. I love to follow indie authors on Instagram, and whenever I see them, you know, they're about to publish their book, I will look forward to reading it. So that was the case with this next one, which is Frost and Sunshine by J.S. Alexandria. This is the first book in their series, and I think it's the first book that both authors have published because it is a duo, but it is a fantasy, and I don't think this one was actually on my January TBR. This one was a bonus one where I was like, ooh, they're publishing it now, like, I want to read. So it's a fantasy, and it has more of like Asian mythology and magic involved. So essentially it follows Slate Melisande, who is like a 30-year-old man living in this, there's like this city that is supposed to be like, I think it's like Irish and Germanic folklore, and there's something different about the city, but no one really knows why. Like, some people believe that there used to be fae and fairies that lived there, whereas regular humans are like, oh no, that's just the thing of lore, but there's always something interesting going on in this city. So Slate grew up in this city, and he teaches martial arts. Him and his dad own this like martial arts school. So he does MMA fighting. And then there is Dani, who is the main female character. And I think it's called lore-kissed, where you have like some fae blood in you, but Dani knows that she's lore-kissed because at one point she was going to be, or these men, fae men, attempted to kidnap her and take her to like the alternative world that is like fae world through like some kind of portal, but she escaped. So now she, you know, once that happened, she realized she wasn't just human, she's lore-kissed, and so now she is like she knows other people who are fae and live in this city, but just like stay under the radar, and other lore-kissed people. So their stories kind of take place separately. At one point after one of Slate's fights, these men are like, you're this other name. They're like, you're Tony. It wasn't Tony, but they're like, you know, Tony, come with us. Like, you're coming to this fae world. He's like, you got the wrong guy. That's not me. And so they were like trying to capture him. Dani was driving by on her motorcycle. She's like, oh my gosh, that guy's getting kidnapped. She could see what they were doing. She was like, oh, those are fae men. So she had this like gun that shoots iron bullets, which the fae are supposed to be affected by. And so she shoots them, helps Slate escape, and then they part ways. Then at another point, I think she like goes to his MMA gym because she like sees it on the back of his shirt when she saves him. So she's like, I need to find out what's up with that guy, because something was happening with the iron where they're wrapping around him that was affecting him really bad. So maybe he's lore-kissed as well. And then starts the whole story where it's not really a spoiler because it happens early in the book. They have sort of a romance. A large part of the plot is that Dani has had something happen to her in the past that we don't yet know from the first book, but something happened in the past where she's hesitant to love, so they commit to having 10 dates until they are together intimately. And so most of the story is actually just them having these dates. This book was ultimately a 3-star for me. While it was portrayed as a fantasy romance, it really was not very fantasy. Like, there was fantasy in like the last 10%, and I guess if you consider the fact that there was the men trying to take Slate in the beginning, that's fantasy, but ultimately it could have just been like people trying to kidnap him, like regular humans trying to kidnap him, and it wouldn't have really changed the story. Like, there wasn't anything really that was that fantasy. I wish that the plot had been more about the Fae trying to capture Slate and, you know, claiming he's this other person. I can't remember the name, but I was saying it's Tony. Like, they're saying he's Tony, but he's saying he's not. I wish it had been more about that, whereas really it was just about Slate and Danny having these dates. So it felt like I was reading a romance novel, which isn't bad, but I wouldn't necessarily have picked it up if I knew that was the case. But like I said, I rated it 3 stars, so it was good. You know, 3, I consider that solid book, like middle of the road, solid. So pretty good for their first round of writing. I will say one part that did kind of rub me the wrong way. At one point, Danny, who is a white woman with red hair, claims that Slate, an Asian man, is, his Asian ancestry is exotic. And I immediately was like, yeesh. Like, oh, I thought we were over calling people of color exotic. So that was a bit rough, but thankfully it only happened once, and there wasn't anything else that I remember in the story about his culture or her culture that was really like focused on in that way. So I wish that hadn't happened, but overall for the story it wasn't a big deal, and I think it was, you know, the rest of the Asian influence was done nicely enough. The next book I'm not going to say too much about because I'm going to do a whole video about it, but on my January TBR I added Sophie Lark's Anastasia. I hadn't read anything by Sophie Lark before this, but I saw this book was coming out and I was just very intrigued. It had some illustration in it, and it's a, you know, retelling of a real person, so I was like, maybe this will be good. And it also had fantasy elements, so I'm gonna do a whole video, but let me just say 5 star. The next book that I checked out, which I don't think was on my TBR, so it was a little bit of a bonus, was My Year of Rest and Relaxation. And I believe the author's name is pronounced Otessa Moshfegh. Excuse me if that's incorrect. But this book was another 3 star for me, so, you know, pretty solid book, and it was very interesting. So I had heard quite, excuse Milo drinking water. I had heard quite mixed reviews about this book, with some people saying like, oh, this girl, as in the main character, is like so privileged and like this is dumb, and some people being like, oh my gosh, like I can relate. So I was very intrigued to see what it was about, but essentially it's about this woman living in New York. I think she's about 25, and both of her parents have passed away, and she had an extremely complicated relationship with them. They left her, after they died, they left her some inheritance and their house, so she's totally fine financially, and she has graduated university and has since then been working in an art gallery once she graduated. She absolutely hates it, like finds no real enjoyment or meaning from her work or honestly anything in life. And the whole book is about her trying to sleep for a year. So she starts taking a bunch of medication and gets in contact with this, I think it's technically a psychotherapist or psychiatrist, who prescribes her these extremely intense medications, some of which make her black out for 3 days on end. And it's kind of her journey to try to black out for a year or as long as she can in order to reset herself. Her goal is to sleep so much that she restarts her life as a different person. She knows that when she wakes up, she'll still be the same like name, and you know, she'll still have all her same belongings, but she wants like a new soul. And so yeah, the book is kind of about that. It brings up different, it's kind of like, I don't know, it reads like stream of consciousness, and it's about, it like brings up different stories of her best friend who's a reoccurring, well, her best friend, but it's kind of more like a frenemy who's a recurring figure. I think it was Riva, and Riva kind of like admires her. They were friends in college, and she like hates Riva. I don't even know the main character's name actually. I don't even know if she has one, but she hates Riva. And I will say, I listened to this on audiobook. I was doing like a super long drive, like 6 hours in January. And so I was like, oh, I'll read this one, because it was like 5.5 hours or something long. And it was perfect. Usually I can't do audiobooks because my brain will start going on a bunch of different things if I'm like actively moving around. So this was a good time for me to finally listen to an audiobook. So I'll keep that in mind for future drives. But next, her time at the art studio and working there is brought up back again in the end, and Riva's a recurring character, and Riva's mom dies, and all the different relationships that she has or lack thereof, like with her dead parents. It was very interesting, and honestly I thought this was like pretty good. In terms of like the mental state and what I think the author was trying to portray, I actually really enjoyed it. The way the author actually wrote certain comments that the main character would say about living in New York, I was like, oh, I can relate to that, having lived there for a few years. So that was kind of fun to see. But regarding her mental state, I think that many who have experienced, you know, dark mental state, like depression, or I don't even know fully what it would be called that the main character has, but just a dark mental state, I think could potentially relate to how the main character processes it. So I enjoyed that because the main character was kind of like a more exaggerated version of things that I've experienced, so I could totally see why she would be feeling that way, or ultimately, you know, doing everything that she did. So it was pretty enjoyable for me, and for the first like 25%, for some reason in my head, I kept envisioning this story being told by Serena van der Woodsen, like from Gossip Girl. Like I could totally see this story being her perspective. So that made it even more like entertaining for me personally. So I enjoyed it. This next one was originally on my TBR, and unfortunately is another DNF for me, and that's The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea. I was really looking forward to this, and the summary of this book and the premise of it really excited me. It was about like a girl, and in her village every year they have to sacrifice a girl to the sea god to try to get his favor, so their village isn't, you know, like swarmed with no crops or like bad weather and all that. So there's this one girl who from their village is designated to be this year's sacrifice, but the main character's brother is in love with her. So the main character sacrifices herself and jumps into the sea god to save her brother's love. And then she goes to like the spirit world to try to win over the sea god and gain his favor. I DNF'd this at 50%, so I made it halfway through, and normally if I'm not liking a book at the beginning, like I'll DNF it. I'll try to get to like 100 pages or like about 20%, and then I'll draw the line. But this one, it actually had me, for the first like 30%, I was kind of wishy-washy, and then by 50%, I just didn't have it in me to finish. I was not interested in this book at all. Like it was just not interesting to me. So I was hoping for more lead up at the beginning of the book, but it starts off straight away with her like running to the boat where her brother and his love interest are going out to sea. I had hoped for more like framing of the story until then, but that's like immediately what we get. So what I shared with you isn't spoilers, like that happens right away. And the book very much has like a little bit of Ariel influence, as in like the Little Mermaid story, and it has similar ambiance and what I envisioned in my head to the Spirited Away movie by Studio Ghibli. I didn't really enjoy, actually. Sorry if you like that movie, but that one was not one of my favorites. but it kind of has a similar vibe in the spirit world where there's, you know, like mystical beings all over the place, and that's kind of what I envisioned. But overall, the plot itself, like each scene kind of like takes place separate from everything else. So it kind of felt like nothing was really connected to each other. Like things were just happening because they were happening. You don't really know in depth about like any of the characters enough to really care about them. Like there's not that good characterization, I guess. And by halfway through, I was just like, what even is this? Like, I don't even know why they're doing these things. So I just didn't really enjoy that. I would have loved more intentional scenes and more of a connection to the main character. So that's gonna be another 1 star because I DNF'd it. And then I think this is the last book that I read in January, but it was a short one, and that is A Psalm for the Wild Built. It's the first book in a series, and I've never read anything by this author before, but it is a short story, and it's about a tea monk. So he kind of travels around and gives tea to people and like has conversations with them as he's giving them this tea, and he travels to different villages. And many years ago in his world, the humans created robots, but the robots got too sentient to where the humans said, okay, you go off on your own into the woods. You'll have your own portion of the world if you don't infiltrate on us. Like the robots got too sentient for the humans' liking. So there was like a treaty where the robots live in this forest and the humans live separately, and they haven't seen each other for I think like 100 years or something. So the tea monk is going about his day-to-day life, and he's feeling unsatisfied. He's like, there has to be more out there. So one day the tea monk decides to go off into the woods to pursue what's out there. There's this like monument, I think, or something that he's after. And while he's there, he comes across this robot. So he's like, oh my gosh, like what is going on? And essentially throughout the book, the monk and the robot, as they're getting to know each other, they're kind of figuring out like, what do humans really need? That's like the overall question of the story. You know, happiness, fulfillment, what's the true value of the life, of our life? And the robot kind of helps the human come to these conclusions. Like I said, it was a short one. It was only 160 pages, so it was a quick read. Ultimately, I gave it a 2 star. I didn't really find it that meaningful or compelling. Like much of the conversation and how the characters ultimately got to their conclusion, I think like the question itself could be very powerful, but the conversations that they were having were very like surface level and very simple. It felt like not really that emotionally impactful. So it was fine, but I wouldn't want to read it again, and I wouldn't not recommend it. Like there wasn't anything about it that was like, oh no, this was awful, but it just wasn't that great. So not too bad, but yeah, wow, what a month. I was hoping for some more 4 or 5 stars. I think I only ended up having the 1 star of Anastasia, so stay tuned for a whole video about that, but not that great of a month. And honestly, I think I don't always plan to do TBR videos. I think maybe I'll do some wrap-ups and share what I read, but I don't always enjoy a TBR because I think what I learned from this month is that like committing myself to reading certain books when I'll start to read it and be like, ooh, maybe I don't want to read this right now, but I felt like I need to finish it because I said I would, made it so that I didn't enjoy a lot of them. Like, I don't think that if I had read them at a different time, I would have liked them more, but I would have at least had more enjoyment this month in reading because I would have read something else if I hadn't made that commitment. I hope that makes sense. So ultimately it's all my fault anyway because I'm the one who set myself up for this, but it was a fun experiment to try. I hope you enjoyed this more longer chatty video. And I would love to know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, or what was your favorite book that you read from January. I have some exciting books. I've already started, reading some good books this February. It's only like the second day, but I've read some good ones, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of the month. Thanks for being here. I'm really glad you tuned in. I will share another video very soon, so I'm looking forward to talking with you more. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you'd like to have more book chats, especially about fantasy reads. And I'll see you in another video very soon.